of course, it's easy to say that, no, of course, I won't resort to designer babies. I think all of us will say that right now, but I think if
Exactly.
the choice is presented in front of you, I think everyone will start to think twice. Hi guys, welcome to the 14th episode of Sound On. So today we'll be talking about gene editing and science. The title is Should There Be a Limit to Science? So with us today we have our friend PC here with us. PC, do you want to just give a short introduction about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Pei Cing, but everyone calls me PC. I am currently a third-year student in biochemistry and microbiology at the University of Sheffield, and I want to go into research science in the future. So yeah, that's about what I do, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's why we call her on the show, because she's like bio and genes. So yeah, so maybe we can start off with a little bit of background so that the listeners kind of know about what genomes, what genes are, what DNAs are, and how exactly. I mean, not just a brief overview of how this CRISPR technology works. So, PC, do you want to just give like an overview, like maybe like in layman terms, so that people understand?
You mean CRISPR?
Or just like genome?
Yeah, sure. So genomes basically, the difference between genomes and genes are that genes are single entities that code for specific traits, and genomes are the whole DNA that you have in the single cell. So that includes the genes and the other DNA elements that don't encode for anything. They are there for other reasons, but they don't contribute to your your phenotype. That's a very that's a term that we use to describe our appearance. But yeah, so genome is basically everything, every DNA element in the cell that is like a blueprint to determine your physical appearance as well as your physiology and everything else in your body.
Yeah. So to be honest, like even though my course is biomed, right? Like I don't know why, but I feel really insecure talking about science. I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's my course of study. So I'm constantly surrounded by people who know so much more than me or has so much more passion and interest about science, right? Yeah. So it's just a disclaimer for today's discussion. Like, even though I'm doing biomed, like, I don't know anything. So yeah. So basically,
there's a thing called imposter syndrome, right? I think that's what you're feeling.
That sounds so familiar. What is it again?
Yeah, imposter syndrome is when you actually know about the topic, but because you feel like there's so much you don't know that you actually feel so insecure talking about it. But you actually just need to believe in yourself that you actually know a lot as well. And because you're surrounded by people that also know a lot, that contributes to that feeling of insecurity. But yeah, it's a concept that people use to describe what you're feeling.
Cool. Okay, that makes me feel a bit better.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. So, Chris, what do you like? What is your impression of, like gene editing and gene editing, designer babies, and all that from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, right, I always take it as that if it has the potential to basically kind of like make humans better, if it can improve things, if it can help lives, for example, and all that. Like, if not mistaken, there has been developments such as like in terms of like gene editing or something like that, such as like like I don't know, if you lose something, they can help you grow it back, for example, things like that. If it's something like that, I'm actually all right with it. I have no qualms about it if it actually like makes life easier and all that. But obviously, I do have specific concerns about the ethics behind it and all that, which we will be discussing later on. But as somebody who is not of a science background, I'm rather unsure about these things. So I always take it as a position as that if it is beneficial, then why not? But the ethics should always be there. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the core of our discussion today, right? Because when it comes to ethics, like for example, you said that if it helps someone, then why not, right? But then there's the distinction between gene therapy and gene enhancement. So whether it's helping to treat diseases, helping to treat disabilities, or is it enhancing individuals that are already healthy. But anyway, we'll touch more on that later. So maybe PC, can you give us a little bit of background about CRISPR, about the technology itself, about how we actually edit genes?
Yeah, so basically CRISPR stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, and what that means is it's basically a technique they found when I think a few years ago there was this microbiologist who was studying bacteria, and bacteria can get attacked by viruses. We call them bacteriophages, and bacteria like us, they also mount an immune response against a viral attack. And the way they do it is by so the way viruses attack things is by they inject their DNA into a living system, and then they use the replication machinery of the living system to replicate their own DNA, and then they basically just escape from that from the cell that they invaded. So that essentially destroys the cell. So bacteria, they overcome this by they take certain parts of the viral DNA, and then they insert it into specific sites in their genome. So now you have a blueprint of whatever has invaded that bacteria before. You have genetic elements of their previous invaders, and bacteria can use those genetic elements, and they complement it with scissors, a biological scissors, to cut out any similar virus that invades the bacteria in the future. So that prevents the virus from coming into the cell and then replicating itself. So that is the way it protects itself. And humans, and then the microbiologists that discovered this, I think, so people publish it, and then someone caught onto the idea and thought this could actually be a really powerful tool to use in biotechnology. So it's basically the same principle. You design a DNA sequence that can be used by the biological scissors to target a specific DNA sequence, and then you just cut it and then destroy it. Or you can swap it with other genetic elements. And that is what CRISPR technology. So you first use the technology to cleave the DNA, to basically just cut the DNA in half, and then you design a DNA sequence. So you first have the genetic element that you want to modify in your cell. You have the genetic modification, and then you have on either side of the genetic modification sequences that match whatever you cut, that match the genome of that you just cut. So then in fact you can use it as a template of sorts to repair across the genetic modification. You will transform this fragment, so the genetic modification flanked by sequences that match your genome, that match the area of the site that you just cut, that you use CRISPR technology to cut it with. You put it into your cells, and then it will stick to the site, because it matches your human genome. So it will anneal. It's so hard not to use scientific terminology.
I'm like trying to like absorb.
Does it make sense?
It does. Yeah. I mean, I'm getting it.
Yeah.
I'm quiet because I don't think I get it as much as I want to. So.
Okay. Just let me know how I can clarify it better. But basically, the thing that you put into your cells, it will then stick to that junction of CRISPR cut region, and then so your DNA replication machinery will basically just repair that that region of that region of someone gave me a word for it, because I'm trying not to use scientific terminology. That we call it a break, basically a break in the DNA. So yeah, it will just repair across the break, and then bam, you have a modification in the genome. So that's what it is.
Okay. So basically, in layman terms, I know this sounds like a very complex idea. Even genetic engineering, it sounds so complex, right? But I think for me, I'm not sure about you. Do you guys do bio in A levels or foundation or SPM?
Yeah.
I did an SPM, yeah.
Okay. So I remember that even in A levels, our experiments we actually did CRISPR. Okay,
Oh, cool.
If I'm not mistaken, okay, I better not say the wrong thing, but it's like I remember it was just the cut and paste technique. I'm not sure if it's the same thing. So they give you the plasmid, right? You just need something that recognizes that spot. Then you just need something that cuts that spot, and then you just fit something in, and then you close it back. So it's basically just a cut and paste mechanism that is actually these days very, very accessible. And like, which brings us to a point that, genetic engineering is actually, it's everywhere. Like, it's in the food that we eat, it's in some animals. GMO crops are so common these days, and it's the things that we eat, right? So yeah, so basically what is stopping, okay, not really stopping, because I wouldn't say that human gene editing is not here yet. I think it's here, but there's just like,
it's already here. I think it's already here.
Yeah. So it's basically like rules and ethics that are stopping these scientists from proceeding, right? But I think what why we haven't really proceeded that far yet, other than rules, is because of the human genome, right? So the human genome was sequenced in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, where humans.
So the first sequencing result came out in 2001, but they sequenced about 90% of the human genome, and that was about our human genome has about 3 billion base pairs. So and they only managed to sequence about 90% because we have limits in sequencing technology. So now they have improved upon that massively. So I think in 2003 they were able to sequence all of the human genome. So 2001 was when it was kind of considered an end to the sequencing project. But 2003 is when they really wrapped up everything.
Okay. So going back to human gene editing, right? I think this is where we transition. We move on to more of like the moral side of it, rather than, so we've been discussing the technical side, right? So now maybe we can move on to the moral side a little bit. So when we talk about human gene editing, right? So there are somatic cells and there are germline cells. So somatic cells are basically cells in our body, most of our cells in our body, but germline cells are cells that are in our reproductive cells, basically like our ovum and our sperms, which will be passed on from generation to generation. So obviously somatic editing is less detrimental than germline editing, because when you edit a germline, it goes on for generation and it basically can alter the whole human species, right? So yeah, so there is somatic and germline, and you can also look at from another point of view. There is gene, which is what I mentioned just now. There is gene therapy and gene enhancement. So gene therapy is treating diseases, and enhancement is enhancing healthy individuals. But the problem is the line between gene therapy and enhancement is really, really blur, because how do we know what should be fixed and what shouldn't be fixed? So for example, dwarfism, maybe, like, should it be fixed? Is it a disability? Like, Chris, what do you think?
Do I think that dwarfism is a disease that should be fixed? No, I don't think that it is. But when it comes to a lot of other diseases, I do understand why people actually would want to fix it. For example, because for instance, some people would feel that if they can like, let's say their child is going to have like a very severe disability, and if gene editing is the only way that they can solve it, if it's going to make their child's life, for instance, less difficult and all that, I really sympathize with people who want to do that. But I do think that there is a limit to it, especially when you bring up like, so that would probably be under gene therapy, right? For example, if you like to fix a disease. So I'm
Yeah.
actually very like cool with gene therapy. Like I have no problems with it. But when it comes to gene editing, I do have a concern about it because, like you mentioned, it can go on for generations. And I think that later on we would be discussing about the idea of like designer babies, for example. If I'm not mistaken, like that probably could come from the idea of like gene editing. And it raises a lot of ethics about that because if we were to basically condone gene editing, for example, right, whilst it might not be necessarily for a bad purpose, I think that it raises questions of ethics because are humans supposed to be able to select what traits that they want to see in their future generations, for example? So I think that that is very problematic. So for me, in terms of gene therapy, I don't think for me personally, because I mean, I don't know the science behind it and all that, but as it seems on the surface, I think that it's perfectly justified. But when it comes to gene editing, I'm more concerned about it.
Yeah, so I have a correction to make. I think gene editing is the same for gene therapy and gene enhancement. It's the same. It's basically using gene editing.
Okay.
Mm-mm. So it's just how you
How you
use
choose
it.
to use it.
How is it
Yeah.
being used? Okay, got it.
So I think the problem comes where, okay, so there are certain diseases, for example, if I'm not mistaken, like sickle cell anemia, like you have this gene means you have the disease. So it's a single gene. It's very easy to spot. It's very easy to remove. And
Yeah.
when it comes to ethics, it's also more, it's more black and white, whether like, if you can edit this gene and remove this disease from this person, like why not, right? So you just remove it. But what about genes? I think most of the diseases are a combination of genes, and it's an interaction of many genes. So that is where one problem comes. And also, for example, okay, this is a complete example. I have no idea, but then, for example, diabetes, right? So it is caused when this gene has a certain variant. For example, a high level of this gene, which enhances the possibility of getting diabetes. So you are changing this gene to make it a variant that is less likely to get diabetes. So the problem comes, is that still therapy? Because it's not removing a disease that is already there. It's removing the possibility of getting the disease. So what do you guys think?
I think it should still be an area of research that should still be investigated because it is improving the patient's life, quality of life, and that's what healthcare is all about, really. I think, I think the ethics side of it is just it should focus more on removing any safety risks of doing the CRISPR editing, because there is still the main limit of CRISPR editing right now is that it's not safe enough to use on people. So patients are not able to make a fully informed consent whether or not they should use it. They're just taking a risk because they already have the disease and they want to improve their quality of life. So yeah, I think research on using gene editing techniques to improve those genetic diseases should definitely still continue. It's just that, yeah, you should really focus on. I don't know where I'm going with this actually. But I do think that it should definitely be
Considered
still be an area of research.
Yeah, because it becomes like a very gray area, a very blur line between like what is actually therapy, what is enhancement. Like therapy is very black and white. You have the disease, you remove it. But when you are changing the possibility of getting a certain disease, then it's somewhere in the middle. It's hard to say yes or no. And okay, so if we dig deeper into the problem, right? So what if we look at embryos? So there's this technology called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Basically, they are looking at an embryo, looking at the genes in the embryo and predicting. They are predicting. So there are, for example, there are a couple of embryos. So when we look at IVF, right? So IVF, you have a couple of embryos of sperm.
Do you want to define IVF?
Yeah, yes, please.
For our listeners, IVF basically means in vitro fertilization. So you're not doing it the normal way. That we call it in vivo fertilization. That means the sperm and the egg are fertilized inside a human body. So in vitro fertilization, in vitro means outside of the cell or in test tubes or something. So that means that you're doing the fertilization in the test tube. You're controlling which sperm is which sperm is fertilizing the egg.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, PC. Background. It's some background scientific check. Okay. So when we use this IVF technique, when we can look at embryos and predict how the baby will be like before they are born, then, for example, you have 6 embryos and you have an option of 6 embryos to implant in your uterus, right? And the problem comes when you can see the possibilities of, for example, this embryo has a higher chance of having this disease, whereas the other embryo does not have. And this is basically called embryo selection. So do you guys think this is right? Because it is still okay, it's not editing, but it's still interfering with the normal process. Yeah. What do you guys think?
Yeah. I feel like you have to also empathize with the people who actually want this process, because there are some genetic diseases that mothers just don't want to pass on to their babies, and I think you have to respect their what they want as well. But I also think that it's something that definitely has to be considered in ethics, because you are tampering with natural evolution. You are trying to eliminate the disease from the human population, and I think you have to be careful in considering which disease you do PIGD with, pre-implantation genetic
Diagnosis.
Yeah. So you have to define which diseases you use it for, rather than just allowing everyone to use it.
Yeah, I agree with what PC has basically said, because there are some diseases that are actually very, very deadly. It can be very detrimental. So if I'm not mistaken, that I've heard that there's this particular form of like disease. I can't remember what is it called, but basically it is genetic. It will be passed down to your children. So apparently, if like, I don't know, like 2 carriers of that disease get married, for instance, like their child would definitely have that particular genetic disease, for example. And I've heard suggestions saying that the only way for that disease to stop being spread down to future generations, and it's going to be very suffering, it will lead to a lot of suffering, is that these people technically just shouldn't have children, for example. Some people have said that, like, if they don't have children, they will not be passing it down to any other person. Well, if you put yourselves in their shoes, probably, like, why should what you want to do in life basically be stopped or hindered by a genetic disease that you don't want, that you can't control? So in such circumstances, I actually feel that, like, if gene therapy or gene editing can actually prevent that from happening, then why not, right? Because it does in a certain way make the world, or make the lives of future people like better, in the sense that you eliminate this disease. Like, some people could even associate it to like a vaccine, for example, right? Like we have a vaccine because we want to stop a particular disease from just continuing to spread, such as what we're seeing right now with coronavirus, for example. I don't know if it's the same thing, but I hope that you guys get the argument that I'm trying to make, that it's stopping a disease from happening anyway. It's kind of like tampering with the natural evolution of disease and all that. So in these instances, I'm actually all right with it. But the point of these gene selection is that I will have a problem to it. So because when it comes to the terms of that bit, but to make this clear first, so like, for instance, in terms of like designer babies, right? Like they can select traits, for example, right? So these traits can, in theory, vary from lower resistance to diseases and even to like gender selection. But if we move towards that path whereby we're not just selecting genes, for example, not simply just to like fight a particular disease or prevent this from happening, but if we move towards like specific traits, physical traits, for example, like selecting gender and all, that would be extremely problematic in my opinion. Because there is a difference between trying to stop something that's extremely detrimental and basically trying to select specific traits for superficial purposes, such as like gender selection, and that will be very problematic. Because I think in the past we've heard things such as like in many societies, for example, like most prominently people always mention, like in China, for example, there was a time in which parents don't want daughters, for example, they want sons. Imagine if they could actually do something like that, like make sure that I will get a son, I don't want a daughter, like that would cause, that is just, I don't think there's a need for me to elaborate further on why.
So you're basically saying you don't want to create genetically superior groups of individuals, because then
exactly,
it just wouldn't be.
Yes.
yeah, so you mentioned about the difference between helping someone with disease and choosing traits such as like gender, maybe like the color of the eyes, their height or something, I don't know. So again, it goes back to the gray area of like, what about genes that control your sleep quality, for example, or genes that have a higher chance of you getting body odor. Like these things, they affect your livelihood. They're not diseases, but without it, you will probably live a lot better because sleep is tied to health. So again, there's that gray area, right? So the question is, where do you draw the line? So yeah, so maybe we can move on to like the negatives of having all these designer babies. I think we have actually roughly touched on that already, but maybe we can go deeper into this issue, right? Like, because you mentioned just now about choosing gender. So that was caused by, so for example, prenatal testing, right? So now you can already know the gender of your baby before it's even delivered. So that technology itself, this is just prenatal testing, that technology itself has actually shifted the demographics of countries like India, China, of like the decrease of the birth of female babies. So that has already has this kind of impact, and it's just prenatal testing. Imagine imagine genetic engineering, what kind of changes to the human demographics this can cause. So yeah, so what exactly, like, imagine a world of like perfect individuals, right? How do you guys think, like, what could be the negatives of this environment?
I think we will enter like a dystopian environment where everyone is just segregated according to whatever perfection they choose to. And it's not, I can't imagine it to be a very nice place to live in, because the beauty of humans is that we're all so different from one another.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my take on it.
It's the same for me actually, because like obviously all of us strive to be as good as we can and all that, but it's kind of like a learning process as well. Like we've identified for ourselves what can we do and how can we improve ourselves and all that, and that's just how humans operate anyway. But if we move towards a direction in which we can actually select, say, like specific traits, our intelligence and all that. Like, yeah, I agree with what PC said, that's actually very dystopian, and I honestly don't know how I'll react to such an environment, because it's clearly very different, and it's very problematic. So which is actually why people actually say that, like, whilst technology developments in tech and all that can be very, very helpful, it has to be used like ethically and responsibly, because I think like you mentioned the point of like prenatal testing, for example, like that was a huge development back in the day. Now it's actually very, very common, and we see the consequences of even things such as like prenatal testing. What are the consequences that can happen because of that? And if we go even further towards like this kind of like gene editing, gene selection and all that, like it's basically like opening a Pandora's box, because a lot of other things can happen and we really don't know what people will be capable of doing.
Yeah, and you also, I feel like if you do gene editing on babies to make designer babies, you're basically just you're not, you have to consider the consent of the babies as well, and you're not asking them for consent. You're not asking them whether or not they want this or they want that. I mean, of course, no one asked to be born, but it's you can't decide what you get born with. So I think if you force all these modifications on someone, it's much more different than.
Yeah.
I don't know how to conclude that.
No.
I think it's just very different.
Yeah, it's actually a very valid point, because none of us actually consent to being born anyway. Like how can we consent to being born? But the thing is that when we are being like, we should be able to live life as normally as possible after being born. But if like you have like these gene selections for like specific purposes. So I think earlier on, before we restarted this call, I shared with you guys the movie that I read based on a novel called like My Sister's Keeper, basically, which is about it was a novel that became like a movie as well, which is basically like there's this family, they had one child that was very sickly. I think she had cancer or something like that. So her parents thought that they basically had a designer baby in order to like basically save their ill child. So initially they only thought that designer baby would only have to like donate her like umbilical cord for like treatment or something like that. When that treatment didn't work, she ended, because she's like so genetically similar to like her sibling, if I'm not mistaken, she basically had to end up spending her life like donating blood, donating like her marrow and stuff like that, and going as far as to donating an organ. And then raises questions, like if these things become very like, if there is a proliferation of these kind of like gene selection or gene editing, whatever you call it, and the impact actually goes towards children, like do they actually consent to this? Like, is it actually right for these children to actually be conceived for a specific purpose that they didn't even choose? So yeah, that raises a lot of ethical questions, which is why we need to be very cautious about these developments in like gene technology and all that.
Yeah, and the major concern with gene editing is because editing is irreversible. So once you do it, you can't go back, and it stays in your genome and future generations. Whereas current healthcare technology, because we have been doing it for many generations. So, I mean, maybe not many generations, but much, much more than gene editing. So we're much more sure on their risks and their safety. And if we already have these existing technologies that I think we should focus on improving current safety technology, current healthcare technologies that have a higher proven chance of success, rather than like gene editing, which is a much more we are not really sure on their effects on the genome, and I think that is a much more permanent thing. A much more permanent change as well.
Yeah, I think the thing about genetic engineering, like even GMOs for plants, the huge problem lies. I know people talk about ethics and all that. I mean, of course, ethics is a problem, but ethics is more of like, it's a gray area, I think, because it's different for different people. I think my biggest concern about all these GMOs and gene editing is that no one really totally understands it fully, and we don't know what the long-term effects would be, right? And bringing it back to the what we mentioned about the dystopian future and all that, I think for us that is what we imagine, because that's what we see in movies, and that is like, for us maybe right now it's quite a far-fetched idea, but then if we bring it back to reality, right, if this technology exists, it's not going to be available for everyone like what we see in movies. It's not going to be like, oh, the whole world is suddenly intelligent. There's going to be a social impact where if the technology is available, it's not going to be available for everyone. It's going to be available for the wealthy, and again, it increases the disparity, because only those who are rich can afford it and can make themselves
can access it. Only the wealthy can access it, and they are the only ones who can access it, and then they can gain from it, and then obviously the disparity widens, because they'll be able to continuously improve themselves, whereas those in the lower sections of society wouldn't be able to. So that raises another problem.
Yeah, and also the thing about genes, right? So before we filmed this, I watched like a very, very, very short documentary on so it's called Explain, and it's on Netflix. So what they said is that the gene doesn't even have to work. We just need someone with status, someone that people believe, to say that, okay, this gene has been genetically enhanced to be better, and they can just claim that this gene works. And humans, like, it doesn't even have to work, but humans will automatically discriminate against the less advantaged. Humans can just do all the work. Again, it goes back to social impact, and it's not just like genetics anymore. So so moving on to maybe like the questions that we can discuss, right? Because this whole topic is just like such a huge question mark. So maybe we can talk about what do you guys think about this whole thing. So if, let's say, because I know we've discussed about ethics, we discussed about the long-term effects, so if let's say you had the power and you had the knowledge in your hands, like, would you actually do it? Because I think for me, like, I think for all of us, we all know that genetic engineering is not the best option. Like, there's probably like bad long-term effects, but then for us to be able to say that, I think shows that we are in a very very, what's the word?
Privileged position.
Yes, privileged, yeah. So we're in a very privileged position. So for example,
Mm.
if we have a genetic disease, for example, or if our child has a disease or someone close to us, if we have the option to just, it's just removing the gene. If we had the option, I mean, of course we would go for it, right? So yeah, what do you guys think about it?
Yeah, because I actually gene editing has been used a few years ago to help HIV patients. So HIV has been a very long term. We have waged a very long battle against HIV. We have tried many therapies and as well as I think maybe not vaccines, but therapeutics to try and help people with HIV. And it's a very crippling disease because the HIV virus, it attacks your immune system. And if you don't have an immune system, you're basically just prone to attack by other diseases, and you get sick from, you can't recover from the most mild diseases. So CRISPR editing has actually been used to I think in 2014 they edited T cells, which is a part of the immune system that it is a very active component of the immune system, and it helps to attack cells in our body that has been infected by the virus. So they outside of the body, they genetically engineered T cells to have resistance against HIV, and the way they do that is by so virus, they enter your cell by binding to your cells through a receptor. So if you don't have the receptor, then the virus can't enter your cells. And so they basically edited those. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So HIV virus, they attack your T cells. I don't know if I mentioned that before. But so sorry. So outside of the body, the scientists they took the T cells and then they engineered it so that they didn't have the receptor. It is a form of gene editing, but I don't think it was CRISPR, because prior to CRISPR, there were other forms of gene editing that they weren't as precise or weren't as easy as CRISPR. But yeah, they edited the T cells to have resistance against HIV, and then they put it into the patient. And I think you know, like when you hear about stuff like this, you think gene editing should still be maintained for the right purposes for like therapeutics and stuff. So yeah, I think we should still have it, but for the right purposes. I think that was quite a tangent actually. I forgot what you were saying previously.
No, just asking whether or not we would actually do it if like improve ourselves. Well, I'm not gonna lie, I think I would, but I wouldn't know for what purposes yet. Like if it's to improve myself, obviously I think that it could. I would probably do it, but I would obviously be very, very careful about the ethics surrounding it as well. So yeah, because like we need to be able to know where we actually stop. So yeah, like I said, I think I'll just share the same position as I did earlier on, which is that, you know, if it's to like stop diseases, cure disease and all that, I don't think that any of us would have any particular problems with that. So yeah.
Yeah. I think when we talk about ethics, like I actually already mentioned it just now, like ethics is a very gray area. I think my biggest concern is, you know, what are the long-term effects, because we don't know like what can happen, right? And for now, for all of us, of course it's easy to say that, you know, no, of course I won't resort to designer babies. I think all of us will say that right now, but I think if the choice is presented in front of you, I think everyone will start to think twice, especially if you have a condition.
I think it's very important for governments all around the world to come together and have like a proper discussion about what should and should not be allowed if we were to proceed with like designer babies and stuff like that. It should, like, a common ground should be established, and there should be like strict policies as well as repercussions to prevent misuse or what is acceptable or what should not be acceptable. But I think if you want to proceed, that like people should actually have rules on what should be. Yeah,
that's absolutely a valid point. I think that if we want to proceed, if we want to go towards this direction of like basically promoting these kind of genetics and all that, there needs to be some form of regulation, I guess. Like it should only be allowed in certain circumstances and all that, in order to ensure that the host of ethical issues that we brought up does not arise. And basically, to just touch again on what EC mentioned earlier on about like empathy, for example, Mel brought up the idea that yes, like many people might resort to designer babies if a scenario is put forward before them and they don't do it. And I think that's very crucial that whilst we have our qualms about it, we need to be empathizing. We need to empathize with people who actually feel the need to actually have to do that. Such as, for example, the story I brought up about that novel and movie called My Sister's Keeper. Like if people are put in that position, they might know that it is unethical. They might know that the designer baby did not consent to a life like that. But the choices being presented at them is so stark. So we need to be careful as well before we judge these people's decisions. So yeah, I think that with that being said, since I believe that none of us have anything else to add on this very, very interesting topic, but also difficult for somebody like me who is not of any scientific background. I have left science, I've put science to one side since I was 17, so this was a very challenging topic, but it's actually very interesting. So to wrap up whatever that we just said, so the idea of like gene editing, gene selection, gene technology as a whole, for example, is undoubtedly very effective and very innovative. It has the potential to prevent diseases and so on. It can even stop certain things from happening. That we can basically prevent a lot of things from happening with these kind of like gene selection or gene editing. But it also has a host of ethical problems, such as when do we stop? Is it right? Such as going as far as things such as selecting traits, including like gender and all that, and sex. But and it also has it will also have societal impacts, such as disparities between sections of society, because when these things such as like gene technology become very easily accessible, whilst it's easily accessible, it will not be accessible to all stratas of society. So it also leads to disparities between perhaps the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. With that being said, this topic about whether should there be a limit to science, I think that it's probably based on the discussions that we have. I think we can establish the fact that we believe that there should be some limit to science, some limit to these kind of like scientific research, including a point that was raised about how perhaps some form of regulations needs to be implemented in terms of like gene editing, gene technology, and all that. But ultimately, I think it is up to our viewers to decide whether or not there should be a limit to science, and if there are limits, what should the limits be? So, thank you very much for joining us today, PC. Very insightful take towards your knowledge about science and all that, and we hope to have you here again on another interesting topic about science.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.